After a brutal trek, Bradley and his dog Canyon finally reached Cougar's Fang Cliff. They followed a secret path, perfectly disguised behind a frozen waterfall, leading to a reinforced steel door painted to blend with the rock. This was the sanctuary of a man who had been dead for 10 years. But as Bradley put his hand out to push, a chill ran down his spine. The door, which should have been sealed shut, wasn't locked. It was ajar, just an inch. And from the darkness inside, a familiar soldier's scent wafted out, the smell of gunpowder, still fresh. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The wind in Solitude Creek, Idaho, does not whisper. It makes announcements. It speaks in long, hollow sighs through the lodgepole pines and sharp cutting commands across the vast, frozen flatness of the ranch. Bradley, 40 years old but feeling much older, pulled the collar of his worn brown leather jacket tighter. The cold was a physical weight, pressing against the red flannel shirt he wore beneath. He stood on the porch of the small ranch house, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his faded denim jeans, his sturdy boots planted on the weathered wood. He was a tall man, lean but strong, with a face that looked carved from the surrounding mountains, rugged, wind-chafed, but with a deep kindness in his eyes that no amount of hardship had managed to erase. His brown hair, long enough to brush his collar, was streaked with gray at the temples. 10 years. 10 years since the accident. 10 years of this suffocating silence, broken only by the wind and the soft padding of four paws on the floorboards behind him. A low, gentle woof of air sounded by his knee. Bradley looked down. Canyon, an 8-year-old German shepherd, looked back up, his intelligent eyes unwavering. The dog's coat, a thick mix of silver gray and white, was built for this weather. He was a veteran, same as Bradley, though from a different war. "Just checking the line, boy," Bradley murmured, his voice rough from disuse. Canyon was not a pet, not really. He was a partner. He was the only reason Bradley slept through the night, or at least the only reason he stayed in bed when the nightmares came. As a retired military working dog, Canyon's instincts were sharp, but his duty had changed. He no longer searched for explosives. He searched for the subtle shifts in Bradley's breathing, the tension in his shoulders, the scent of panic before it could consume him. The dog moved with the quiet dignity of a retired soldier. He had been Bradley's shadow for the last 5 years, but their connection was older than that, tied together by the man they had both lost. Bradley's gaze drifted to a photograph on the mantelpiece, visible through the frosty window. It was of his father, Tom. He still remembered the video call, the connection grainy and skipping from a forward operating base in Afghanistan. His father's face, smiling, filled the small screen. Tom, a lifelong FBI agent, should have been awkward around a high-drive military dog, but he wasn't. "He's a hero, Bradley," Tom had said, his voice tinny but warm. "And he deserves a good retirement. I'll keep him safe for you. I'll keep the ranch safe for you. You just focus on coming home." Canyon had been injured, his service cut short. Bradley, still having 6 months left on his tour, had been frantic, pulling strings to get Canyon adopted out to a handler program stateside. But Tom had quietly stepped in, flown to the base in Germany himself, and personally handled the complex MWD retirement and adoption. For 8 months, while Bradley finished his tour, it had been just Tom and Canyon on the Idaho ranch. They had forged their own bond. Tom, the quiet intellectual, and Canyon, the stoic warrior. Tom had been the one to ease the dog out of his shell shock, teaching him that not every loud noise was a threat, that a civilian hand could be gentle. When Bradley finally came home, the dog was waiting, a bridge between the man he was and the father he adored. And then, only a year later, Tom was gone. A climbing accident on Cougar's Fang Cliff. A freak storm. A slip. Now all Bradley had left of his father was this ranch and the dog who loved them both. The wind picked up, shifting from a howl to a high-pitched keen. The sky, a pale gray all morning, had darkened to the color of a fresh bruise. "Storm's moving in fast," Bradley said, more to himself than the dog. "Let's check the old barn, make sure the corrugated tin is holding." Canyon followed him, their path a synchronized rhythm of boot and paw through the new-fallen snow. The old barn was 100 yards from the house, a relic from the 1970s, listing slightly to the left. It was where Tom had stored his old equipment, junk mostly, things Bradley hadn't had the heart to sort through. As they approached, the first real gusts hit, a wall of ice and air that stole Bradley's breath. He leaned into it, pulling his hat lower. The wind didn't just howl now, it screamed. They spent the afternoon securing what they could, but the storm was too fast, too violent. By 4 p.m., the world was gone, erased by a whiteout. Bradley and Canyon retreated to the house, the fireplace roaring, the dog asleep at his feet. But Bradley couldn't settle. The house groaned under the pressure. The sound that woke him from a fitful doze wasn't the wind. It was a deep, structural groan of tortured wood, followed by a heavy, muffled whump that vibrated through the floor. Canyon was on his feet before the sound even finished, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Bradley grabbed the heavy flashlight by the door. What was that? The old barn? The snow stopped just before dawn. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. Bradley pulled on his jacket and boots, the leather stiff and cold. He opened the front door, and his breath caught. The old barn was gone, or rather, half of it was. The main roof had collapsed under the weight of the snow, a tangled V of splintered rafters and twisted metal. "No," Bradley whispered. "No, no." It wasn't the loss of the building. It was the violation. Another piece of his father, erased. He walked numbly toward the wreckage, Canyon pacing nervously at his side. The air was frigid, the new snow almost 4 feet deep. As they got closer, Bradley heard a new sound, a faint gurgling. "What now?" he sighed, rubbing his temples. Where the heaviest roof beam had fallen, it had punched through the barn's rotted floorboards. But it had gone deeper. The impact, combined with the sudden thaw from the pipe's contents, had fractured an old, forgotten water main that fed the livestock troughs. The pipe, which should have been frozen solid, had burst. Water was bubbling up from the ground, turning the snow and debris into a freezing, muddy soup. "Just perfect," Bradley muttered, his shoulders slumping. This meant digging in a blizzard's aftermath. He was so focused on the plumbing disaster that he didn't notice Canyon at first. The dog was frozen, statue still, 20 feet away. His ears were pinned forward, his body low, his ruff slightly raised. He wasn't looking at Bradley. He wasn't looking at the broken roof. He was staring, transfixed, at the muddy, bubbling water. "Canyon? What is it, boy?" Canyon didn't move, but a low whine started in his throat. He took a cautious step forward, then another, his black nose twitching rapidly. He lowered his head to the slurry of mud and snow. He sniffed, then recoiled, shaking his head. Then his entire demeanor changed. He wasn't a pet. He wasn't a companion. He was MWD Canyon, and he was on duty. He began to dig. "Canyon, no, stop. It's just mud, boy. Get out of there." Canyon ignored the command. His paws moved like pistons, throwing clumps of icy mud and snow behind him. He was digging with a frantic, obsessive energy that Bradley hadn't seen in years. "Canyon, heel," Bradley commanded, his voice sharp. The dog stopped digging for a second, looked at Bradley with a startling intensity, and let out a single, sharp, percussive bark. It was not a request. It was an alert. Bradley's anger evaporated, replaced by a cold knot of adrenaline. "What is it? What do you smell?" He grabbed a shovel from the intact side of the lean-to. He waded into the freezing mess, his boots sinking deep. "Where, boy? Show me." Canyon shoved his nose back into the hole he'd started, barking once more. Bradley plunged the shovel into the earth where the dog indicated. The ground was soft from the gurgling water. He hit something hard, just a foot down. Not a rock, not a root. It felt plastic. He dropped the shovel and fell to his knees, plunging his gloved hands into the icy mud. His fingers closed around a handle. He pulled, the object resisting with a heavy, sucking sound. It came free suddenly, a large, black, waterproof case, a pelican case, military grade. Bradley stared at it. It was sealed tight, but it was not from the ranch. It was covered in mud, but it was otherwise undamaged. Canyon stopped digging. He sat back on his haunches, panting, whining softly, his nose nudging the side of the box. Bradley's heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched the pulsing of the broken pipe. Shaking from cold and a sudden, nameless fear, he grabbed the handle. He hauled the heavy case out of the mud, and without a word, turned and walked back to the house. He placed it on the kitchen floor. Canyon sat beside it, refusing to leave. Bradley wiped the mud from the two heavy clasps. He paused, his hand trembling. Then he flipped them open. The seal broke with a faint hiss of air. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in custom foam, was a satellite phone, a rolled-up topographical map, and a single, shock-proof hard drive. The kitchen was too warm. Bradley kicked the front door shut, the sound a dull thud in the heavy silence. The warm, dry air of the house, smelling of pine smoke and coffee, felt wrong, a stark contrast to the icy mud still clinging to the pelican case and his own frozen jeans. Canyon paced by his feet, whining low in his throat. The dog was not settling, not returning to his bed by the hearth. He kept his head low, sniffing the air around the black case that Bradley placed on the worn, wooden kitchen table. The case made a heavy, wet sound as it landed. Bradley stood for a long moment, just staring at it. His breath fogged in the air of the entryway. He unzipped his brown leather jacket, but didn't take it off. His hands were numb, tingling as the blood returned. He could feel his heart hammering a heavy, unsteady rhythm against his ribs. This was not a time capsule. This was something buried. And in his world, things were buried for only one reason: to keep them from being found. Canyon nudged his hand, the wet nose insistent, before returning to the case, sniffing the clasps where Bradley's hands had been. "Okay, boy. Okay. Let's see what this is." His movements felt robotic. He pulled out the items. The satellite phone was an older model, heavy, its screen dark. He pressed the power button, but nothing happened. The battery was long dead. The map was rolled tight. He gently unrolled it on the table. It was a USGS topographical map of the Frank Church wilderness, but it was covered in handwritten annotations. Red ink marked trails that didn't exist, elevation lines, and one small, precise X drawn on the far side of Cougar's Fang Cliff. Then there was the hard drive. It was a modern solid-state drive, but it was housed in a heavy, shock-proof rubber casing. He turned it over in his hands. He ran his thumb, still partially numb, over the underside. He felt it before he saw it, a faint inscription laser-etched into the plastic. Solitude Creek coordinates, 1998. Bradley stopped breathing. The kitchen, the case, the wind rattling the window, it all dissolved. He was 14 years old, standing in the icy spray of the Salmon River, holding his first fly rod. His father, Tom, was standing next to him, his hand on his shoulder. "This is it, Bradley," Tom had said, his voice quiet, serious in the way that always made Bradley listen. "This spot? This is our spot. Just ours." It wasn't just a memory. It was a promise. 1998, the year his father had bought the ranch. The coordinates were not just a location, they were sacred. Bradley's hands were shaking. He fumbled for his laptop on the counter, knocking over a cold mug of coffee. He didn't bother to wipe it up. He sat at the table, plugged the drive into the USB port. A password prompt immediately filled the screen. A single, blinking cursor. His fingers, clumsy with cold and memory, typed the string of numbers. The prompt vanished. The drive unlocked. There was only one file. README MP4. He stared at the icon. This was the moment of truth. This was the point where he could throw the drive back into the mud, fix the pipe, and go on pretending his life was just the quiet, dull ache of the last 10 years. Canyon, sensing his hesitation, pushed his head under Bradley's hand. Bradley clicked the file. The screen went black for a second. Then a video player opened, and a face filled the screen. Bradley's breath hitched. He knew that face. He knew the set of the jaw, the intelligent eyes, the way one side of his mouth quirked up when he was serious. But it was wrong. This man was 10 years older than the man in his memory. This was not the Tom who had died on Cougar's Fang. This was a man who had lived those 10 years. His hair was almost completely gray, not just at the temples. His face was thin, etched with lines of stress and isolation that hadn't been there before. He was in a small dark room, the walls concrete or stone. Then the man spoke. Bradley. The voice. It was his father's voice, not from a memory, but from a speaker. Raspy, urgent. Canyon, who had been lying by the chair, sprang to his feet. The dog's ears went flat. A deep, confused whine started in his chest. He crept toward the laptop, lowering his head as if unsure of what he was hearing. "If you are watching this," Tom said, his eyes looking directly into the camera, into Bradley's soul, "it means I'm dead." A cold void opened up in Bradley's stomach. Dead? But he was. He was looking right at him. "I'm sorry, son," Tom continued, his voice tight with an emotion Bradley couldn't place. "I had to protect you. I had to let you go. The most important thing was your safety." Canyon reached the laptop. He sniffed the speaker, then looked at Bradley, his head cocked, his eyes wide with a profound canine confusion. He heard his master. He smelled his other master. His world was breaking. "This box," Tom said, "is a failsafe, a dead man's switch. My system is set to send you an email, an encrypted message with the location of this box if I miss my 72-hour check-in. If you're seeing this, my check-in has been missed. It means they found me." Bradley's mind was reeling. They? This drive contains everything. Everything on Project Nightshade. Everything on a man named Malcolm. He's the director of Ares Global Solutions. He is the man who forced my hand. This is the evidence. Tom leaned closer. "Listen to me, Bradley. This is my last request. Take this drive. Take the map. Go to Agent Teresa Vaughn. Her number is on the sat phone. She's the only one I trust. Give her everything. Do not look for me. Do not investigate. It's too late for me. Live your life, son. That's all I ever wanted. I love you." The screen went black. The video was over. The only sound in the kitchen was the ticking of the wall clock and the frantic whining of Canyon. Bradley was frozen, his mind a whiteout of conflicting information. He's dead. He's alive. He's dead. Canyon, overwhelmed, ran to the front door. He barked a sharp, demanding sound, then ran back to Bradley, nudging his hand hard. He was agitated, demanding answers. The man he loved, the man who had cared for him for 8 months, was in the room, but he was gone. Bradley looked at the dog. Then he looked at his own phone, sitting on the counter. "It has sent you an email." His movements were slow, disconnected. He picked up his phone. He unlocked it. He went to his email. He checked his inbox. Nothing but bills and a newsletter from the hardware store. He checked his junk folder. Nothing. He checked his spam folder. Nothing. There was no email, no message, no trigger from a dead man's switch. He looked at the open door of the barn, the twisted metal, the muddy, watery hole where the pipe had burst. The only trigger had been the storm. The only trigger had been the pipe. The only trigger had been Canyon's nose. The realization hit Bradley like a physical blow, knocking the wind from his lungs. "Canyon," he whispered, his voice trembling. The dog stopped whining and looked at him. He said the switch would activate if he missed his check-in. Bradley's mind was racing, putting the pieces together with a terrible, new logic. "But I didn't get the message. I found this by accident." He looked at the laptop, his eyes wild. If I found this by accident, but the switch was about to be triggered, or was just triggered? The world tilted. The fog of 10 years of grief dissolved, replaced by a single, terrifying, brilliant beam of light. "He's not dead," Bradley said, the words feeling strange on his tongue. "Canyon, he's not dead. Not yet." He stood up, knocking the chair over. He wasn't grieving. He was afraid. A cold, sharp adrenaline he hadn't felt since Ramadi flooded his system. "He's alive," Bradley said, his voice louder now, steadier. "He's alive and he just missed his check-in. He's in trouble. Right now." Canyon, sensing the absolute shift in Bradley's scent and posture, the fog of depression replaced by the sharp, metallic smell of purpose, stopped his confused pacing. He stood tall, his body alert, his eyes locked on Bradley. He was no longer a confused pet. He was MWD Canyon. He was ready for a command. Bradley looked at the video file. Tom's last words. "Do not come for me." He grabbed the hard drive. He grabbed the map. He walked to the sat phone and plugged it into the wall charger. "He asked me to live my life," Bradley murmured, his hand closing into a fist. "He doesn't get to ask that. Not anymore." He walked to the rack by the door, his movements sure and precise. He ignored the photo on the mantel. He grabbed his heavy parka and the keys to his truck. "He's in trouble, boy," Bradley said to the dog. "Let's go find him." Canyon let out a single answering bark, a sound not of confusion, but of resolve. They had a job to do. The kitchen was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the quiet, heavy breathing of the dog. The man Bradley had been for the last 10 years, the quiet, grieving rancher, the man of routines, the ghost, had evaporated. In his place stood a soldier. The shift was absolute. The fog of depression and PTSD, which normally sat on his shoulders like a physical weight, had been burned away by the white-hot fuel of adrenaline and purpose. His eyes, usually softened by a decade of loss, were now clear, focused, and cold. Canyon saw the change instantly. The dog, who had been pacing in confused agitation, became still. His whining stopped. He stood alert, his gray and white head high, his tail held low and steady. He was no longer a confused pet. He was MWD Canyon, awaiting orders. Bradley moved. He didn't rush. He was economical, his actions precise. He went to the hall closet and pulled out a large military-style backpack, setting it on the table next to the hard drive. He began to pack for a mission. First came the essentials. He retrieved his climbing gear from a large plastic bin, a 60-meter rope, a harness, a small rack of carabiners and anchors, an ice axe, crampons for his boots. He glanced at the map. The X was not on a trail. It was on the cliff face itself. He had known, instinctively, that this would not be a simple hike. He went to his bedroom and opened the locked cabinet. He pulled out his hunting rifle, a bolt-action .30-06. He checked the action, his movements fluid and practiced, sliding a magazine into place. He strapped it to the side of his pack. From a safe box, he retrieved a semi-automatic pistol, checked the load, and holstered it on his hip. He was a man who lived in the wilderness. The weapons were not unusual, but he handled them now not as a hunter, but as a soldier. He added 2 thermal blankets, a military first aid kit, 2 full canteens, and a bag of high-energy bars. He carefully wrapped the hard drive in a waterproof bag and placed it in the pack's central pouch. He slid the charged sat phone into a side pocket. Finally, he stood and pulled on his gear. He was already wearing his faded blue denim jeans and the red and navy flannel. He slipped his sturdy work boots on, lacing them tight. Over it all, he pulled on the old, familiar brown leather jacket. He left it unzipped, the cold a minor inconvenience. He looked at Canyon, who had not moved, his eyes locked on his partner. "All right, boy, it's time to go." Canyon didn't bark. He simply walked to the door and waited. The old pickup truck roared to life, its engine complaining about the frigid air. The ranch was miles from any main road, and the snowplow wouldn't be out here for at least another day. Bradley put the truck in 4-wheel drive and expertly guided it down the long, unpaved track, the tires churning through the deep snow. The drive was slow, the truck's cab filled only with the sound of the heater and Canyon's steady, quiet panting. He drove as far as he could, up the winding Forest Service road that led toward the Sawtooth Range. He managed 6 miles before the road became impassable, a solid drift of snow blocking the path. He parked the truck, killed the engine, and the world went silent. "Looks like we're on foot from here," Bradley said. He put on his pack, wincing at the weight. He grabbed the ice axe, using it as a walking stick. The moment they stepped out of the truck, the brutality of the journey became clear. The air was thin and bit at his exposed face. The temperature was well below freezing, and the world was a blinding, brilliant white. The snow was deep, often past his knees, and each step was a battle. Canyon, built for this, moved with more grace. The German Shepherd bounded ahead, then doubled back, staying within 20 yards of Bradley, his paws patting almost silently on the fresh powder. For 2 hours, the only sounds were the crunch of Bradley's boots breaking the crust of the snow, the rush of his own breathing, and the occasional slide of snow falling from a pine branch. The climb was steep, following a game trail that Bradley and his father had hiked a lifetime ago. But the memory brought no comfort, only a tightening in his chest. They were getting close. He could feel it. The trees were thinning out, giving way to the sheer granite that formed the base of the high peaks. And then they rounded a bend, and the mountain itself came into view. Cougar's Fang Cliff. It was a sheer 1,000-foot wall of granite and ice, looming over them like a frozen wave. It was a place of terrible beauty, and for 10 years, Bradley had not been able to look at it. Today, he had no choice. The wind was different here, and was different. In the valley, it was a sigh. Here, it was a weapon. It funneled through the narrow gaps and crevices of the rock, a channeled, focused force. It didn't howl, it shrieked. A high-pitched, falling whistle that rose and fell in a sickening cadence. Bradley stopped. The sound was wrong. It wasn't wind. He was on a rooftop in Ramadi, the sun a hammer, the air thick with the smell of dust and cordite. The whistle. It was the sound of an incoming mortar, the sound that came just before the world exploded. His body reacted before his mind. He didn't duck, he didn't run. He froze. His pack, suddenly weighing 1,000 pounds, seemed to root him to the spot. His ice axe was no longer in his hand. It was a rifle, and it was too heavy to lift. He was staring at the cliff, but he was seeing a dusty, beige wall. His breath locked in his chest. He couldn't move. He was back in the episode, the trigger, a simple sound, plunging him a decade back and a world away. Canyon was 10 feet ahead. He stopped, his ears flattening, and turned. He saw his partner. Bradley was rigid, his eyes wide and unseeing, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The dog's training, both military and medical, took over. Canyon knew this state. He had seen it in the barracks, in the dead of night. He knew that barking, a sound of alarm, was the wrong tool. A sudden noise would make it worse, confirming the imagined threat. This was not a moment for an alert. It was a moment for grounding. The dog moved back with a quiet, deliberate purpose. He stepped directly in front of Bradley, blocking his partner's line of sight, forcing the glassy-eyed stare to land on him. It wasn't enough. Canyon pushed his body hard against Bradley's left leg, a firm, steady, and warm pressure. "I am here." Bradley didn't respond. He was still on the rooftop. Canyon tried again. He pushed his head under Bradley's gloved, frozen hand, forcing it upward. He nudged it hard. "I am real." The contact. The wet, cold nose on his glove. The feeling of fur. Bradley blinked. Canyon shoved his muzzle into the man's hand again, this time with a low, impatient whine. It was a sound that said, "Come back, now." The ice shattered. The rooftop in Ramadi dissolved. The smell of dust was replaced by the clean, sharp scent of pine and the familiar, musky smell of his dog. The whistle was not a mortar. It was just the wind. Bradley's body finally unlocked. A long, shuddering breath tore from his lungs, visible as a great white cloud in the air. He was shaking, his knees weak. The backlash from a PTSD episode was as draining as a physical fight. "Canyon!" he gasped. He slid his hand from his glove and buried his bare fingers in the dog's thick ruff. The warmth was immediate, a tangible anchor to the present. He leaned against the dog for a full 30 seconds, simply breathing. Canyon stood perfectly still, supporting his weight. "Good boy," Bradley whispered, his voice shaking. "Good boy. I'm okay." He straightened up, his body aching, his mind exhausted. But the cold resolve was already returning. He looked up at the sheer granite wall. The wind whistled again, but this time he heard it for what it was. "He's up there," Bradley said, his hand still on Canyon's head. "Somewhere up there." He took a deep breath of the freezing air, picked up his ice axe, and took the first step toward the base of the cliff. Bradley's hand, still resting on Canyon's head, was trembling, not from the cold, but from the residual shock of the trigger. He took a steadying breath, the air burning his lungs, and refocused. He was not a victim. He was a soldier. He had a mission. He pulled the map from his jacket. The X was not just on the cliff. It was in it. He scanned the granite wall, comparing the map's contours to the physical rock. He saw it. 50 yards to their left, a massive curtain of ice, a frozen waterfall, hung suspended from an overhang. The map's X was precisely behind it. "The entrance must be behind the ice," he murmured. The traverse looked treacherous, a narrow, ice-slicked ledge. He pulled his crampons from his pack. Canyon whined, sensing the danger. "I have to, boy. You wait here." But as Bradley took a step toward the ledge, Canyon barked, a short, sharp command. The dog ran past him, not toward the icy traverse, but toward a dense thicket of snow-covered pines growing right against the cliff base. He disappeared into the branches. "Canyon!" A moment later, Canyon's head reappeared. He barked again. Bradley followed, pushing through the heavy, snow-laden branches. And then he saw it. Hidden from view by the trees was a narrow, man-made path, barely 2 feet wide, cut like a switchback into the rock. It was covered in snow, almost invisible, but it was a clear path. The icy traverse was a decoy, a trap. This was the real entrance. "Good boy, Canyon. Lead the way." The path was steep, but it was secure. It wound upward, ending on a wide, sheltered ledge hidden completely behind the frozen waterfall. And set into the rock was a heavy, reinforced steel door, painted to match the granite perfectly. Bradley's heart hammered. This was it. The door was not locked. It was open. Just an inch. A cold dread, heavier than the ice, settled over Bradley. A man in hiding for 10 years, a man as meticulous as his father, did not leave his door ajar. He slowly unclipped the strap on his hip holster, his fingers finding the familiar grip of his pistol. He drew the weapon, the movement smooth and silent. "Canyon, watch." The dog needed no command. His body tensed, dropping into a low, silent crouch. He was no longer a companion. He was a weapon, his eyes fixed on the dark gap. Bradley used his boot to push the door open. It swung inward without a sound, the hinges perfectly oiled. The smell hit him first, not the smell of a dusty, unused cabin. He smelled ozone, warm electronics, and something else. A sharp, metallic tang like old pennies. Gunpowder, recent. He stepped inside, sweeping the room with his pistol. Canyon was at his heels, a silent gray shadow. The room was not a rustic cabin, it was a high-tech bunker. A bank of computer servers hummed quietly in a rack. Maps and charts covered one wall. An overturned chair lay on the floor, its legs in the air. And there were signs of a firefight. Brass casings littered the floor, 2 different calibers. A laptop on a heavy steel desk had a single, neat bullet hole through the screen. A dark, ugly smear on the concrete floor, still wet, made Canyon's nose twitch. This was not a 10-year-old memory. This was a fresh wound. This had happened hours ago. "Tom," Bradley whispered, his voice catching. "Don't move." The voice came from a dark alcove to his right. It was rough, steady. Bradley heard the distinct, sharp sound of a rifle's safety clicking off. Bradley froze. He kept his pistol pointed at the floor, but didn't drop it. Canyon spun, a low, terrifying growl rumbling deep in his chest. He planted himself between Bradley and the dark, his teeth bared, his ruff standing on end. "I said, don't move," the voice repeated. A man stepped out of the shadows. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with gray, disheveled hair, a face etched with panic, and a heavy hunting rifle leveled at Bradley's chest. "Who are you?" the man demanded. "How did you find this place?" "I'm looking for my father," Bradley said, his voice flat, his eyes locked on the man's trigger finger. "Your father?" The man's voice faltered. "Tom?" The tension was a physical thing. Canyon was coiled, a taut spring, ready to launch. Bradley was calculating the fraction of a second it would take to raise his pistol. And then Canyon stopped growling. The dog's ears twitched. He let out a low, confused whine. He cocked his head, his gaze shifting from the man's rifle to his face. He took a hesitant step forward. He sniffed the air. The dog's entire posture changed. His tail gave a single, uncertain wag. He walked forward, past the rifle, and nudged the man's hand. The man looked down at the gray and white head, his jaw dropping. He lowered the rifle. "Canyon?" he whispered, his voice breaking. He looked from the dog back to Bradley, his eyes wide with a sudden, impossible realization. "My goodness! You're Bradley? You're Tom's son." Bradley kept his pistol raised, his suspicion undimmed. "How do you know this dog? Who are you?" "I'm Felix," the man said, his hands now visibly shaking. He let the rifle hang. "Felix Grant. I was your father's best friend." The name hit Bradley like a memory. Uncle Felix, the man who always brought him model airplanes when he visited. He hadn't seen him in 15 years. "He's alive, isn't he?" Bradley demanded, his voice raw. "I don't know," Felix said, anguish in his voice. "I was so afraid. He missed his check-in." Bradley lowered his pistol. "What check-in?" "Tom, he had a protocol, a 24-hour check-in, just a signal to let me know he was okay. He missed it yesterday morning." Felix ran a hand through his hair. "I got on the first flight to Boise. I drove all night. I got here an hour ago and found this." He gestured at the bullet-riddled room. "I thought they'd finally gotten him." "They?" "Ares Global. Malcolm?" Felix looked at the bloodstain on the floor. "Bradley, you need to understand. What happened 10 years ago, on the cliff, it wasn't an accident." Bradley just stared at him. "Tom was investigating Malcolm even back then," Felix said, his voice low, conspiratorial. "Project Nightshade. Malcolm found out. He sent an assassin, a man named Vincent Gallo. Tom fought him right out there on the ledge. Gallo went over the side." Felix's eyes met Bradley's. "Tom called me, not the Bureau. Me. I was his friend. I was also the chief of forensics for the regional office." Felix walked to the computer servers, his hand resting on the warm metal. "I made a choice, Bradley. I saw Tom's chance to escape, to get out from under Malcolm's thumb, to keep you safe." "What did you do?" Bradley asked, though he already knew. "I drove back to your house," Felix said, his voice barely a whisper. "To the ranch. You were deployed. I took Tom's hairbrush from the bathroom. I took his electric razor." He turned back, his face a mask of guilt. Gallo's body, after a 1,000-foot fall, it was unrecognizable. I took the samples from his body, and I swapped them with the DNA from Tom's hairbrush. I personally signed the coroner's report. I falsified the evidence. I testified that the DNA matched. I buried your father." The room was silent. "You did it," Bradley said, his voice flat, "to protect him, to protect me." "Yes," Felix said, his face flooded with relief. "Yes, exactly. He loved you so much, Bradley. He did it all to protect you." Bradley stared at him. The word echoed in the bunker. "Protect me." His hand, hanging by his side, slowly, almost unconsciously, clenched into a fist. "Protect me?" he whispered. The voice was so quiet, Felix leaned in. "Bradley? Protect me?" The word was a roar, an explosion of sound that made Canyon flinch and Felix stumble backward. It was not a question. It was a judgment. Bradley turned and slammed his fist into the steel-plated wall of the cabin. The sound was a dull, heavy, painful impact. "He left me alone!" Bradley shouted, the voice of a man broken. The decade of suppressed grief, of confusion, of quiet, lonely pain erupted. "I spent 10 years. 10 years. Grieving him. I went to counseling. I thought I'd lost everything. He was pacing now, a caged animal, the energy too much to contain. He kicked the overturned chair, sending it skidding into the server rack. "Do you know where I was?" he screamed, turning on Felix, his finger jabbing at the older man. "Do you know where I was when I got the call that my father was dead? I was in Afghanistan. I was on a patrol in Ramadi, trying not to get blown up, grieving my father, and the whole time, his voice cracked. He was hiding in a hole in a rock while I was burying a flag for him." The rage finally broke. The strength went out of him, as if the fire had consumed all his fuel. He slumped against the wall, sliding down into a crouch, his head in his hands. He let me believe he was dead. The anger was just the armor. Underneath, it was all just pain. Canyon, who had retreated during the explosion, now moved in. He pushed his heavy head under Bradley's arm, whining, his body pressing firm against his partner, grounding him. Not from a PTSD flashback this time, but from a grief that was raw and new all over again. Felix watched, his face a mask of profound guilt. "Bradley, he did it because Malcolm would have come for you next. He did it because he loved you." True. Bradley looked up, his eyes red, his face streaked with the dirt of the journey. "That's not love, Felix," he said, his voice hollow. "That's a lie." He took a shuddering breath, pulling Canyon closer, burying his face in the dog's gray fur. He stayed there for a long time. Finally, he looked up, the soldier returning. "You said he missed his check-in yesterday. Where is he now?" The cabin was a tomb of cold air and secrets. Bradley remained crouched, his face buried in the thick, familiar fur of Canyon's ruff, his knuckles white against the steel wall. The echo of his own shout, "Protect me?" still hung in the air, a raw testament to a decade of pain. Canyon whined, a low vibration of shared distress, and licked the salty track of a tear from Bradley's cheek. Felix stood by, his face a mask of guilt. He let the silence stretch, giving the younger man the respect of his grief. He had dropped a bomb on Bradley's world, and he knew the shrapnel was still flying. Finally, Felix spoke, his voice quiet, heavy. "He never wanted you to feel this. He never wanted you to find this cabin, or this mess." He walked over to the desk and picked up the topographical map Bradley had brought. "He did it all so you could have a life, a normal one, the one he couldn't have." Bradley scrubbed a hand over his face, pushing himself up from the wall. He was breathing hard, but the violent edge of his rage was cooling, leaving behind a cold, desolate exhaustion. "What is it, Felix? What is so important that he would do this? To me? To himself? What is Project Nightshade?" Felix gestured to the humming server rack, its green and amber lights blinking in the gloom. "That," he said. "Ares Global Solutions, Malcolm's company. It's not just a private military contractor, Bradley. It's a technology firm. It's a private intelligence agency. And for the last 15 years, it has been Malcolm's personal kingdom." He began to pace, his words picking up speed. "Tom, your father, wasn't just a regular special agent. He was brilliant. He was assigned to a financial crimes task force, investigating defense contract fraud. That's how he found Ares. He was following the money. And he found more," Bradley said, his voice flat. "He was looking at the bullet holes in the wall." "So much more," Felix whispered. "Project Nightshade. It's not a thing, Bradley. It's a program. An illegal, off-the-books assassination program, sanctioned by no one, run by Malcolm. Fully autonomous drones. He uses them to eliminate risks to his business. Journalists who got too close. Politicians who wouldn't take his money. Whistleblowers." Felix stopped pacing and looked at Bradley, his eyes burning with an old intensity. Tom saw the logs. He stumbled onto a server he shouldn't have been able to access. He saw the target lists. He was the only one in the bureau who connected the dots, and Malcolm found out. "So Tom ran," Bradley said, the bitterness returning. "He left me. He hid." "He was cornered," Felix shot back, his own voice rising. "Malcolm sent Vincent Gallo to silence him. When Gallo failed, when your father was forced to kill him on that ledge, Tom knew it was over. He knew Malcolm would never stop. He'd find another way. He'd come after the only leverage he had left. The one thing Tom cared about more than his own life. You. Bradley was silent. He looked at Canyon, who had moved from Bradley's side and was now sniffing intently at the dark, smeared bloodstain on the floor. The dog's tail was low, rigid, and he let out a low, uneasy growl. He wasn't growling at Felix. He was growling at the scent. For 10 years, Felix continued, his voice softer. The plan worked. He was a ghost. I was his only contact, his anchor to a world he'd left behind. We thought we'd won, that you were safe, that he had paid the price and the debt was settled. What changed? Bradley asked, his gaze fixed on his dog. Canyon's reaction was pulling him from the past. Felix's face darkened. The timeline? It all changed 3 months ago. Tom, he got restless, or maybe just desperate. He couldn't just hide, not while knowing what he knew. He got a lead on the one thing that could burn Ares to the ground, the original authorization ledger. A hard copy, signed by Malcolm himself, detailing every Nightshade operation. He made a move, Bradley pieced together. Yes, a brilliant, stupid, dangerous move. He got the data. We think he has it on a small, portable drive. But in the process, he tripped a high-level silent alarm on their internal servers. For the last 10 years, Malcolm thought your father was dead. For the last 3 months, Malcolm has known he is alive. He's been hunting him, Bradley. This wasn't a random search. It was a targeted manhunt. The pieces slammed into place. The video, the urgency, the dead man's switch. This, Bradley gestured to the chaotic room. This is the hunt. This is the end of the hunt, Felix said, his voice grim. A man named Cross. He's Malcolm's enforcer. He leads their hunter team. He's not a boardroom thug. He's a professional. He found this place. They came in hard, sometime yesterday afternoon. Felix walked to the cluster of shell casings on the floor. He nudged one with his boot. These are 5.56, standard tactical. But these? He pointed to a different, larger caliber casing. These are 45. That was always Tom's. He fought back, Bradley. He wasn't executed in his sleep. He fought his way out. Canyon, who had been following Felix, suddenly whined and moved toward a back door Bradley hadn't noticed, a heavy steel exit on the far side of the room. It was slightly ajar. Felix pointed to the smeared bloodstain. He was wounded. He went out that back tunnel. He escaped. But he's hurt, Bradley. He's hurt, and he's been out in that freezing cold for almost 24 hours. Bradley stared at the back door. His mind was still a war zone, his heart torn between a decade of grief and a lifetime of love. He felt betrayed. He felt abandoned. He lied to me, Bradley whispered. It was the last stand of his anger. Felix, seeing the young man still trapped in the past, finally snapped. He grabbed the front of Bradley's flannel shirt, his older, smaller frame shaking with a desperate energy. Listen to me, Felix hissed, shaking him. This is not about 10 years ago. It is not about your anger. It is about right now. He let go, shoving Bradley back a step. Yes, he lied. He made an impossible, terrible choice. He tore his own life apart. He buried himself alive to keep you safe. And now he is out there, bleeding in the snow, while the man who caused all this is hunting him with helicopters and thermal scopes. Felix's chest was heaving. He saw the look in Bradley's eyes, still distant. He tried again, his voice cracking, the anger gone, replaced by a raw plea. Your anger is justified, Bradley. It's real. I know that. But it won't mean a single thing if your father bleeds out in the next few hours. That was the round that found its mark. The words cut through the fog. Bleeds out. The soldier in Bradley, the one who had been triggered on the mountain, now fully awoke. The son, lost in his pain, stepped aside. The mission was clear. The target was his father. The enemy was Cross. Bradley's focus snapped. He wasn't angry at Tom anymore. He was angry at Malcolm. He was angry at Cross. You're right, Bradley said, The voice was not his own. It was clear, cold, and commanding. He turned and grabbed the sat phone from the counter, which he'd plugged into a wall charger when he first arrived. The battery indicator was green. "He told me to call Agent Vaughn," Bradley said, his fingers already flying over the keypad, powering it on. "Teresa Vaughn," Felix said, a spark of hope in his eyes. "Yes, she's the only one inside the bureau he trusted. His in case of emergency contact, the one who was supposed to get the evidence." The phone screen lit up, searching for a satellite. Bradley looked at the map, then at the blood trail. He looked at Canyon, who was poised by the back door, waiting. "He went out the back tunnel," Bradley said. "We follow him. We find him before Cross does." He looked at Felix. "Are you with me?" Felix grabbed his rifle. "Tom's my brother. I'm with you to the end." The air in the bunker was thick with the ghosts of the last 24 hours, the metallic tang of gunpowder, the coppery scent of blood, and the heavy silence of Felix's confession. Bradley's rage, which had erupted like a flash flood, had receded, leaving behind the cold, hard bedrock of a new reality. His father was alive. He was wounded. He was being hunted. "I'm with you to the end," Felix had said, his voice raw. Bradley nodded, the movement sharp, decisive. He was no longer the grieving son, lost in the past. He was the soldier, focused on the objective. He turned to the counter where the satellite phone was charging. The small green indicator light was solid. He picked up the heavy handset. It felt alien in his hand, a relic from a different kind of life. He powered it on. The screen glowed, a pale blue, and after a moment, it chimed softly, a digital tone indicating it had found a signal. Felix watched, his hands twisting together. "There's only one number in the contacts, the one he told me about, just in case." Bradley navigated the simple menu. One entry. Vaughn. He pressed the call button. The line was quiet for a long moment. Then a series of electronic beeps sounded, the handshake of a secure connection, followed by a faint, static-filled ring. It rang once, twice. Canyon, sensing the tension, moved to Bradley's side, his body a solid, warm presence against his leg. On the third ring, a voice answered. It was a woman, her voice crisp, professional, and ice cold. "This is a secure line. Who is this?" Bradley's throat was dry. "My name is Bradley. I was told to call this number. I'm a friend of Tom's." A heavy, dangerous silence settled on the line, the silence of a predator that has just heard a twig snap. "Tom is dead," the woman's voice replied, all warmth gone. "He died 10 years ago. I don't know who you are or how you got this number, but you are interfering in an active federal investigation. Hang up now, and you might only face charges for possessing a stolen sat phone." She was a wall. She was right. He was just a voice on a phone, a ghost calling about a ghost. "Felix is here with me," Bradley said, trying a different B-roll. "I don't know a Felix," she shot back, too quickly. A lie. "You have 5 seconds." This was his one chance. The password, the memory, the key. Solitude Creek coordinates, 1998. Bradley said the words, the name of his own childhood, into the void. The silence that followed was louder than his shout had been in the cabin. He could hear the faint electrical hiss of the open line, a sound like the breathing of a distant star. He counted 1, 2, 3 seconds. The voice that returned was not the same one. The ice was gone, shattered, replaced by a focused, white-hot intensity that vibrated through the receiver. "Say that again." "Per Solitude Creek, 1998. A sharp, controlled exhale. Who did you say you were?" "I'm Bradley," he said, his voice raw. "I'm his son?" "Oh," the woman breathed. The word was not a word. It was a prayer of shock. "My goodness, Bradley, Tom always talked about you. He called you his anchor." The professionalism was back, but it was now personal. "I'm Special Agent Teresa Vaughn. I was your father's partner on this. I'm in Boise." "He's alive," Bradley said, cutting her off. He didn't have time for sentiment. But he's in trouble. I know, Vaughn said, her voice grim. I've been working this end for 3 months, ever since his signal went hot. We knew he was alive, but we couldn't find him. He was too good. Bradley, you must listen to me. The Bureau is compromised. Ares Global has eyes everywhere. My office, OPR, is the only clean channel. You cannot trust anyone. Ares found him, Bradley said, his grip tightening on the phone. I'm in his hideout. It's been hit. It was attacked yesterday. He fought, he was wounded, and he's out there, in the snow. They're hunting him right now. Ares? Or their hunter team? A man named Cross? Vaughn's question was rapid fire. Felix, standing nearby, his face pale, heard the name. He nodded frantically at Bradley. Felix is here with me, Bradley said. He says it was Cross. A sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Then he's got ours, maybe less. Cross's team is the best. They'll have thermal imaging, they'll have air support. They're not just contractors, they're hunters. So what's the plan? Bradley asked, his military instincts taking over. What's the extraction? Where's the cavalry? There is no cavalry, Vaughn said, her voice flat, brutal. It's just me, and I'm in Boise, 3 hours away if I break every record, and that's too long. Bradley, you are his only chance right now. The words landed with the weight of a physical blow. He wasn't calling for help. He was receiving an assignment. But I am your support, Vaughn continued, her voice a rapid-fire command. That phone you're holding, it's an older B-roll model. It has a dedicated encrypted GPS beacon. It's not for calls, it's for tracking. I need you to activate it. There should be a small protected switch on the side. Flip it. Bradley turned the phone over. He saw it, a small rubber-sealed switch. He flipped it with his thumb. A tiny green light, no bigger than a pinhead, began to glow steadily. It's on, he said. Good. Vaughn's voice was filled with a sudden fierce energy. I have you. I have your signal. I am routing every asset I can trust, which right now is almost no one, to that beacon. I am now your eye in the sky as much as I can be. She paused, and her voice, just for a second, lost its steel. Bradley, Tom's video, the one you were supposed to get? His last order was for you to run. He never ever wanted you in this. He would be so angry he'd probably thank me for trying to stop you. He's my father, Bradley said, the words tasting like iron. I know, Vaughn said. Now, listen to me. Do not turn off that phone, no matter what. I will find you. Find your father. Get that ledger he was carrying. And Bradley? Yes. Stay alive. I'm coming. The line clicked, and the call was over. The bunker was silent again, but the silence was different. It was no longer the hollow echo of grief. It was the charged electric silence of a ticking clock. Bradley looked at Felix, who seemed to have aged another 10 years in the last 5 minutes. He looked down at Canyon, who was poised, alert, his gaze fixed on his partner. He wasn't alone. He had an old man with a rifle. He had a trained warrior by his side, and he had an angel on his shoulder, 3 hours away. He turned and faced the back door of the cabin, the one that led into a dark, unknown tunnel, the one his father had bled his way through. He pulled the rifle from his back, checking the action. He nodded at Felix. Let's go, Bradley said. The green light from the satellite phone's GPS beacon was a tiny, insistent star in the gloom of the bunker, a silent promise of an eye in the sky. But the sky was miles away. Down here, in the cold, granite-lined room, there was only the three of them. Bradley stood for a second, the heavy silence of the ended call pressing in. He, Felix, and Canyon, a broken soldier, a retired analyst, and a dog, standing in a room that felt like a fresh grave. Felix was the first to move, his old joints stiff with cold and fear. He started toward the dark, narrow opening of the tunnel Tom had disappeared into. We have to go. We have to hurry. Wait. Bradley's voice was calm, sharp, and it stopped Felix in his tracks. The soldier had taken over. The son, with his boiling rage and 10 years of grief, had been field-stripped and stowed. This was not a rescue, not yet. This was an operation. "We don't go in blind, Felix. We go in smart." Bradley walked, not to the tunnel, but back to the center of the room, near the overturned chair. He switched on the high-powered flashlight he'd clipped to his pack. The white, focused beam cut through the shadows, illuminating the scene like a forensics report. "He told me in the video," Bradley murmured, more to himself than to Felix. "He's a ghost, but ghosts leave tracks." He handed Felix a spare flashlight. "Hold this. Don't turn it on. Just be ready." Canyon, sensing the shift, stayed at Bradley's heel, his body tense, his black nose testing the air. The dog whined, a low, anxious sound. He knew the scent of his master's, and the air was thick with Tom's, laced with the copper and salt smell of adrenaline and blood. Bradley knelt. His gloved fingers brushed the concrete floor. They breached the main door. Tom was at his desk. He kicked the chair back. He pointed the light at the steel desk. "See? Impact marks." He used it for cover. His beam moved to the floor, illuminating the small, brass-colored casings. 5.56, he said, touching one. "At least 3, maybe 4 of them. They came in fast, spraying." "My goodness, Tom," Felix whispered, his hand on his mouth. "He was ready," Bradley said. His voice was cold, analytical. He crawled forward, his light finding something else near the base of the server rack. A heavier, larger casing. A .45 caliber. This was his. He followed the trail. He wasn't static, Felix. He wasn't hiding. He pointed. A .45 casing here, another one 5 feet back near the wall, and a third by the tunnel entrance. He stood up, his mind painting a clear picture of the firefight. He wasn't caught running away. He was fighting his way to the tunnel. He fired, he moved, he fired again. He was suppressing them, making them keep their heads down. He was falling back to his escape route. "He was always a professional," Felix said, his voice trembling. "The best agent I ever knew." "He was a fighter," Bradley corrected. He looked at the scene, not as a son, but as a squad leader. He took the fight to them, and he made it. He walked to the tunnel entrance. The dark, coppery stain on the floor was darker here, glistening wet in his flashlight beam. He was hit. Looks like he was hit as he was entering the tunnel. Canyon, who had been patient, could not wait any longer. He pushed past Bradley, his nose hovering just an inch over the bloodstain, his body quivering. He let out a single, heartbroken whine. It was the scent of his pack, his family. And it was wrong. "He's bleeding." "That's too much blood," Felix said, his voice cracking. He stepped forward, his own light clicking on, illuminating the dark, narrow passage. "No," Bradley said. "Wait." He held Felix back, his hand on the older man's shoulder. He knelt at the mouth of the tunnel, shining his own light into the darkness. The blood trail was not a panicked spray. It was a series of heavy, consistent drips. "Felix," Bradley said, his voice quiet, intense. "Look." Felix leaned in. Just inside the tunnel, perhaps 3 feet in, was a small, dry alcove, barely visible. Tucked inside it, away from the path, was a discarded wrapper for a quick clot combat gauze. Next to it, an empty needle, a field suture kit, and a roll of blood-soaked gauze. Bradley reached in and picked up the wrapper, his glove brushing the discarded items. "He didn't just run, Felix. He was hit, and he made it into the tunnel. He got into this alcove, out of the line of fire, and he stopped." He shined the light on the bloodstain at his knees. "This is where he bled, but this..." He pointed to the wrapper. "This is where he fixed it." Felix stared, his mind struggling to comprehend. He stopped? To perform self-aid while they were shooting at him? "He's a soldier," Bradley said, a flicker of something new in his voice. Not just anger, not just grief. It was a cold, hard respect. He knew he couldn't run if he was bleeding out. He knew the rule. Win the firefight. Stop the bleeding. He got to cover, and he stopped the bleeding. Bradley stood, his eyes scanning the tunnel. "He's not panicking, Felix. He's hurt, but he's not panicking. He's moving with purpose. He turned to his partner. Canyon was already looking down the tunnel, his body vibrating, his gaze fixed on the darkness. He knew the scent. He knew the mission. "Tom always said," Felix whispered, "that you were more like him than he was. He said you had a core of iron he'd never seen." Bradley ignored him. He was focused. He pulled the strap of his pack tight. "Felix, I need you to stay right behind me. No matter what, you keep your light on my back and you keep moving. Do you understand?" Felix, seeing the authority in the younger man, just nodded, gripping his rifle. Bradley turned to the dog. He unclipped his rifle from his pack and racked around into the chamber, the sound a solid, satisfying mechanical click that echoed in the small room. He looked down into Canyon's upturned, intelligent eyes. "Canyon," he said, his voice low and firm. The dog's ears perked. "Okay, boy, it's time to work. We're going to find him." He pointed into the dark, blood-streaked tunnel. "Find Junta." The command was the only thing Canyon needed. The dog's entire demeanor, which had been confused and distressed, snapped into sharp professional focus. He was no longer a pet. He was MWD Canyon. He lowered his head, his nose inhaling the scent of Tom's blood from the trail. He didn't whine. He didn't hesitate. He took a confident step into the darkness, his paws silent on the concrete floor, a gray and white shadow moving toward his lost master. "Let's go," Bradley said, and he clicked on his headlamp. The beam cut a cone of white into the black. He, Felix, and the dog stepped out of the compromised bunker and into the unknown, following the trail of a man who was refusing to die. The word Junta was still echoing in the narrow, man-made tunnel. It was pitch black, a concrete-lined tube carved into the mountain's heart, but the beam from Bradley's headlamp cut a sharp white cone through the darkness. Canyon was in front, moving with a low, controlled gait, his claws clicking softly on the smooth floor. He was not panicked. He was working. The scent of Tom's blood was thick in the enclosed space, a fresh copper trail that was easy to follow. Bradley was right behind him, rifle at the low ready. Felix brought up the rear, his breathing already becoming ragged, his own flashlight beam bouncing nervously off the damp walls. How much farther?" Felix panted, his voice a dry whisper. "It's an escape tunnel, Felix, not a subway," Bradley said, his voice flat, all his focus on the dog in front of him. "It's built to get him out of the kill box. It'll be short." As if summoned by his words, Canyon stopped. The dog stood at the end of the tunnel, which was blocked by a heavy insulated steel door. He whined, just once, and nudged the door with his nose. Bradley stepped forward, putting a hand on Canyon's flank to steady him. He scanned the door. There was a simple, heavy-duty latch, unlocked from this side. He looked at Felix. "Ready?" Felix nodded, his face pale, his rifle clutched to his chest. Bradley put his shoulder to the door and pushed. With a scrape of ice and a rush of frigid air, the door swung open. They were outside. The sudden, blinding white of the snow-covered landscape made both men squint. They were on a narrow ledge, perhaps 500 feet higher up the cliff face than the main bunker entrance, and completely hidden from below. The wind was a roaring, physical presence, tearing at their clothes and stealing their breath. "He came this way," Bradley said, his voice instantly snatched by the gale. He pointed. The trail was horribly clear. A single set of boot tracks, dragging slightly, pressed into the deep snow, and next to them, every few feet, was a bright, terrible splash of red. Tom was still bleeding, though the drips were smaller now. The combat gauze was working, but not well enough. Canyon was already moving, his nose to the trail, but Bradley stopped him. "Canyon, wait." The dog looked back impatient. Bradley looked at Felix. "This isn't enough." "What do you mean?" Felix shouted over the wind. "The trail is right there." "The trail leads into that," Bradley yelled, gesturing to the endless expanse of the Frank Church wilderness spread before them. 1,000,000 acres of frozen, jagged mountains. "A man moving on foot? We'll lose him as soon as the wind picks up or he crosses a stream. If Cross has thermal scopes, They'll find him before we do. He unslung his pack and pulled the topographical map from the pelican case. He unrolled it, weighting it down on the snow with his ice axe, shielding it from the wind with his body. We need to know where he was going, he said, his glove tracing the lines. He wouldn't run blind. He's a professional. He'd have a fallback, a rally point. His fingers stopped. There, Cougar's Fang. That's the bunker. He traced the bloody path they were on. It leads northeast. What's northeast? Felix asked. Bradley stared at the map. There was nothing, just empty contour lines, miles of them. And then he saw it. A faint hand-drawn circle in a different color ink, so small he had almost missed it. It was 15 miles away, on one of the highest peaks in the sector. Raven's Perch, Bradley whispered, the name catching in his throat. What? Raven's Perch, Bradley said, louder. It's an old fire lookout, abandoned in the 1980s. We used to hike up there when I was a kid. He looked at the trail. It's where he's going. It has to be. The realization settled on him. His father, wounded and hunted, was making his way to a place that held their shared memories, a place that was theirs. Bradley pulled the satellite phone from his pack. The green GPS light was blinking steadily. He shielded the phone from the wind and hit the call button, connecting to the only number. The line clicked. Vaughn. Her voice was immediate, no greeting. It's me, Bradley said, shouting over the wind. We're out of the bunker. We're on his trail. He's wounded, but he's moving. Felix is with me. I see your GPS, Bradley. You're on the move. What's your status? His objective is a fallback, Bradley said, his words clipped. An old fire lookout called Raven's Perch. I'm sending you the coordinates from my own GPS. He tapped his wrist-mounted device. He's heading there, but so is the enemy. Cross's team is on his 6, and they've got to be less than a day behind. He paused, the next part the hardest. He's bleeding, Vaughn. He's hurt. We're following, but I don't know if we're fast enough. There was a silence on the line, filled only by the wind and the electronic hiss. Then Vaughn's voice came back, and the steel was back in it. Understood, Bradley. Raven's Perch. I'm closer than I thought. The roads were clear. I'm diverting now. Her next words sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Get there. Get your father. But I need you to understand. I will try to be there first. If Cross gets to that lookout before you do, it's over. The line went dead. Bradley stared at the phone. I will try to be there first. She wasn't just support. She was a ghost, racing to a rendezvous. He put the phone away. The mission was no longer a search. It was a race. He turned to Felix. Vaughn's coming, but she's not the extraction. We are. We have to beat Cross to that lookout. He knelt in the snow. From his pocket, he pulled the bloody gauze he'd retrieved from the bunker's tunnel, the gauze his father had used to pack his own wound. It was stiff with frozen blood. He looked at Canyon. The dog had been waiting, poised and patient, his eyes fixed on Bradley's face. Bradley held the gauze out, just inches from the dog's black nose. Canyon, he said, his voice low, intense, cutting through the wind. You know this scent. You know who this is. Canyon's nose twitched. He inhaled deeply, his entire body registering the scent. It was Tom. It was his pack. It was family. And it was wrong. It was laced with the sharp, acidic tang of pain. Bradley held the dog's gaze. He's hurt. The hunters are behind us. We are the only ones who can find him. No more games. No more waiting. He stood up and pointed, not at the blood trail, but at the distant, jagged peak on the horizon that held Raven's Perch. Find Tom, he commanded. Go, Junta. The command was absolute. The MWD SAR training, the years of partnership, the bond of family, it all coalesced into a single, perfect purpose. Canyon did not bark. He did not run wildly. He lowered his head, his powerful shoulders tensed, and he began to move. He was not just following the blood, he was reading the trail. He was tasting the air, sensing the wind, calculating the path of a man who was trying to save his own life. He moved with a relentless, low-to-the-ground power. Bradley chambered a round in his rifle. He looked at Felix. "Stay close. Don't fall behind." He and the old man fell in step behind the gray and white dog, a two-man, one-dog rescue team, following a trail of blood into the vast, beautiful, and unforgiving heart of the Idaho wilderness. The trail was no longer just a trail. It was a race against a dying clock. For 15 miles they had pushed through the Idaho wilderness, a relentless, punishing trek. The snow deepened as they climbed, the air thinning to a razor's edge. Felix, his face gray with exhaustion, was lagging, but he never complained. He just kept his eyes on Bradley's back and kept moving. But the engine of their small group was Canyon. The German Shepherd was a machine, his body built for this. He was no longer just following a scent. He was pulling, driven by a primal need to find the man whose blood was on the wind. The blood trail itself had thinned, the drips becoming smaller, farther apart. Tom was slowing down, or he was running out of time. "We're close," Bradley said, his voice a hoarse rasp. He didn't need the map anymore. He could see it. Raven's Perch. It was a small glass and wood box perched on stilts, a relic of a bygone era clinging to a high, windswept peak. It looked tiny and fragile against the immense, hostile beauty of the mountains. Canyon, sensing his target was near, let out a single, high-pitched, excited bark. He broke into a run, his paws digging deep, churning up clouds of powder. "Canyon, wait!" Bradley yelled, but the dog was gone. Bradley and Felix scrambled up the last steep incline, their lungs burning. They burst into the small clearing. The lookout was silent. There were no tracks but their own. He's not here," Felix panted, leaning on his rifle, his chest heaving. "We're too late." "No." Bradley was scanning the ground. Canyon went this way. The dog was at the base of the lookout's rickety wooden staircase. He was whining, his body quivering, his nose pressed to the bottom step. Bradley pushed past him, taking the stairs two at a time, his rifle ready. The door was closed. He put his shoulder against it. It was locked. "Dad!" he yelled, the name feeling strange, new. "Tom! It's Bradley! We're here!" Silence. Then, from inside, a faint scraping sound, a heavy bar being lifted. The door creaked open just a few inches. Bradley pushed it open. The room smelled of old wood, rust, and iron. Tom was slumped in the far corner against a wall of old maps. His face was a waxy pale gray, his lips cracked. His left leg, wrapped in a field-dress tourniquet that was soaked through, was propped up on an old crate. But his eyes were sharp. They were his father's eyes. And in his right hand, he was clutching a small, black portable hard drive. "Bradley," Tom whispered, his voice a dry rattle. He looked past him at Felix, who had staggered up the stairs. You fool, Felix! You brought him here. You were supposed to let me—" "We found the box," Bradley said, his voice thick. He crossed the room in 2 strides, dropping to his knees. The reunion, the one he had dreamed of and dreaded, was a mess of blood and pain. The storm broke the pipe. Canyon found it. Canyon? Tom looked at the dog, who was pushing past Bradley, whining, licking his master's face. Tom's hand, the one not holding the drive, came up and buried itself in the dog's ruff. "You found me, boy. You were always the smart one." "They hit the bunker," Bradley said, his hands already moving, pulling his medical kit from his pack. "We followed the trail." You shouldn't have," Tom said, his gaze fixed on his son. He was angry. He was relieved. He was afraid. "You weren't supposed to—" A sound. Canyon, who had been overjoyed, suddenly went rigid. He spun from Tom, his head snapping toward the window, a low, savage growl starting in his chest. "What is it, boy?" Bradley asked. And then he heard it too. Faint at first, then growing, a rhythmic, deep thump, thump, thump that was not the wind. It was the sound of rotor blades beating the thin mountain air. Tom's eyes closed. Cross, he whispered. A sleek black helicopter, no markings, burst over the ridge. It didn't land. It hovered 50 feet above the trees, a dark, predatory bird. "Get the windows!" Tom roared, the sudden strength in his voice shocking. Felix, galvanized, moved to one small window. Bradley grabbed his rifle and moved to the other, his heart a cold stone in his chest. The helicopter's side door was open. 5 men in black tactical gear were visible. They weren't fast roping. They were a hunter team, and this was their target. The siege had begun. The first shot was not a loud crack. It was a heavy thud as a high-caliber round from a suppressed rifle punched through the wooden wall, inches from Bradley's head. Then the automatic fire started, a torrent of noise. The air filled with the sound of rounds impacting wood, of glass shattering as the lookout's windows exploded inward, showering them in a spray of deadly ice. The smell of cordite filled the tiny room, and that's when it happened. And the noise, the percussion, the smell, the chaos. Bradley was no longer in Idaho. He was on a rooftop in Ramadi. The sun was a hammer. The air was thick. The screams were in Arabic. He saw Felix drop to the floor, covering his head. He saw his father, trying to raise his own pistol. And Bradley? Bradley was gone. He shoved his rifle through the shattered window, his eyes wide and unseeing, and he just started firing. He wasn't aiming. He was screaming, the words torn from his throat, a language of pure, primal fear. "Get some! Get some! You want some?" He emptied his magazine in a single, blind, frantic burst into the trees. "He's lost it!" Felix yelled over the din. "Bradley!" Tom saw it. He saw his son, the soldier, vanish, replaced by the trauma he had lived with for a decade. He was wounded, he was dying, but his son was in trouble. He roared, his voice cutting through the gunfire. "Bradley! Bradley!" The man didn't hear him. He was fumbling with a new magazine, his hands shaking, his breath hitching. Tom tried again, his voice raw, using the only weapon he had left, the anchor. "Bradley, breathe! Control your shots!" he yelled. Just like we practiced at Solitude Creek." The words, Solitude Creek. The memory hit Bradley like a physical blow. 14 years old, a .22 rifle, the smell of pine and river water, his father's hand on his shoulder. Breathe, squeeze. The rooftop in Ramadi dissolved. The glass tower of the lookout returned. He looked at his rifle. He was shaking, drenched in sweat. "Reload, son," Tom said, his voice quiet now, but razor sharp. "Reload, and this time, aim." Bradley's shaking hands dropped the empty magazine. He slammed a fresh one home. The click was solid. He was back. And then a new sound entered the fight, a single, heavy, authoritative crack from a high-velocity rifle, from a different direction, below them on the ridge. One of the Ares men who was trying to flank the lookout suddenly spun, his body jerking, and fell face first into the snow. "Was that you?" Felix yelled. "Not me," Bradley said, scanning. Tom let out a dry, gasping laugh. "Teresa," he whispered. "She's here." Vaughn, she had made it. The dynamic changed. The incoming fire lessened, became more sporadic. The hunter team was now the hunted. Bradley saw his chance. "They're disorganized. I'm moving." He was about to move to a better window, to get a line of sight on the man who was shooting at Vaughn. He never saw the real threat. Cross, the team leader, hadn't come with the main group. He had used the chaos. He was already at the blind spot. The door. The door exploded inward, kicked off its hinges, slamming against the wall. A man in black tactical gear stood there, his rifle raised, his face obscured by a balaclava. He wasn't aiming at the old man, Felix. He wasn't aiming at the wounded man, Tom. He was aiming at Bradley, the other soldier, the primary threat. Time slowed to a crawl. Bradley saw the rifle's muzzle, a small, black hole, swinging toward his chest. He couldn't raise his own in time. "No!" he heard Felix scream. He braced for the impact. He never saw the gray and white blur. Canyon, who had been lying low, protecting Tom, saw the threat. He had been trained for this. He had been trained for war. He did not hesitate. He launched himself across the small room. He was not a pet. He was a weapon. He did not go for the man's throat. He went for the weapon. He performed the bite and hold, a technique trained into him since he was a puppy. His massive jaws clamped down on Cross's right arm and the rifle itself, just as the man pulled the trigger. The man screamed, a sound of pure rage and surprise. His rifle fired, the bullets going wild, tearing harmlessly into the ceiling, showering them with wood splinters. It was the 1 second Bradley needed. He didn't think. He reacted. He fired twice. 2 controlled shots, center mass. Cross stumbled backward, his hands clutching his chest, his rifle clattering to the floor. He fell out the doorway and disappeared from view. The lookout was suddenly, blessedly, silent. "Bradley," Felix started. But Bradley wasn't listening. A sound had cut through the silence, a sharp, wet yelp that was more painful to him than any bullet. He turned. Canyon was on the floor. He had stumbled back, his side a spreading dark stain of red. Cross's last reflexive shot, a wild pull of his sidearm's trigger, had found its mark. "Canyon!" Bradley dove to his side. The dog was breathing in shallow, wet gasps, his tail thumping once, weakly on the floorboards. He licked Bradley's hand, his eyes full of a terrible, trusting confusion. 3 weeks. 3 weeks had passed since the siege at Raven's Perch. 3 weeks since the world had cracked open and revealed a truth far stranger and more painful than the lie Bradley had lived with for a decade. The late autumn sun was low in the sky, casting long golden-blue shadows across the porch of the Solitude Creek Ranch. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and the cold mineral rush of the Salmon River nearby. The thump-thump-thump of rotor blades was gone, replaced by the occasional cry of a hawk and the whisper of the wind through the lodgepole pines. The external war was over. The news cycle, which had exploded with the story, was finally moving on. Malcolm, his face a mask of cold fury, had been arraigned in federal court. Ares Global Solutions, exposed by the contents of the hard drive Tom had clutched in the lookout tower, was being dismantled by a team of federal receivers. Project Nightshade was no longer a secret whispered in a bunker, but a national headline. Agent Teresa Vaughn had, in the end, been the cavalry. She and a small trusted team had stormed the lookout moments after the firefight, securing the scene, the prisoners, and the evidence. And, most importantly, she had called in a life flight helicopter, not for the agents, but for Tom and Canyon. Now, on the porch, the silence of the aftermath had settled, heavy and tense. Bradley sat on the top step, wearing his old brown leather jacket over the familiar red flannel, a steaming mug of coffee cradled in his hands. He stared at the river, his knuckles white on the mug. In the chair behind him, Tom sat, his left leg propped up on a stool, still wrapped in a light cast. He had recovered physically, with a speed that surprised his doctors. He was thin, the 10 years of isolation still carved on his features, but his eyes were clear. He looked at his son, his gaze a mixture of hope and a profound, bone-deep fear. Between them, lying on a patch of sun-warmed wood, was the bridge that connected them. Canyon was resting, his head on his paws. A large patch on his left shoulder had been shaved bare, revealing a long, angry line of dark stitches. The bullet from Cross's pistol had missed his lung by an inch, a fact that made Bradley's stomach clench every time he looked at it. The dog was moving stiffly, favoring his side, but the vet had declared he would make a full recovery. He was a warrior, resting. The 2 men had been sitting this way for almost an hour, trapped in an orbit of unspoken words. They had survived the hunters, the firefight, the lies. Now they faced the harder part, the truth. Bradley's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, rough, almost carried away by the wind. "I've been thinking about when I got back." Tom tensed. He stopped watching the hawk and turned his full attention to his son. "From Ramadi," Bradley continued, his gaze fixed on the rushing water. I wasn't right. I knew I wasn't. The nightmares, the noise? The world was too loud. Everything felt wrong." He took a shaky breath. "I was a mess. I was lost. And I needed my father." He turned his head, his eyes haunted by his own set of ghosts, finally meeting Tom's. But you weren't here. You were dead." His voice cracked just slightly on the word. "I sat right here on this porch for a solid year, just falling apart. And you were alive. You chose your justice. You chose your war over your son." The accusation, the core of 10 years of pain, landed in the quiet air. Tom flinched as if Bradley had struck him. He looked away, his jaw working silently. He had rehearsed this moment. He had defenses. He could explain the tactical necessity, the mortal danger, the fact that Malcolm would have used Bradley as leverage. He could have argued that his choice, though brutal, was the only one that kept his son alive. He looked at Bradley's face, a face carved by a different war, and he saw the lie in all his own justifications. Tom was silent for a long time. The only sound was the wind and the soft thump-thump of Canyon's tail on the wooden porch as he dreamed. "You're right." The words were so quiet, Bradley almost missed them. He turned, surprised. He had expected a defense, an argument. Tom looked up, his eyes shining with a raw, painful honesty that Bradley had never seen. I told myself every day for 10 years that it was to protect you. And it was. I did. I saved your life. I kept Malcolm away from you. I kept you safe." He leaned forward, his hands gripping his knees. "But you're right. That's not all it was. I was so deep in the mission, so blinded by the need to win, to make it all count. I saved your life." He took a shuddering breath, the confession tearing from him. "But I destroyed 10 years of it." He looked at his son, his voice breaking. "I wasn't here when you came home. I wasn't here when you needed me. I was wrong. I was wrong not to trust you, not to trust that we could have faced them together. I was a coward in my own way. I ran, and I'm sorry, Bradley." The apology hung in the air, simple and devastating. It was everything. The silence that followed was different. The tension hadn't vanished, but it had changed. It was no longer the silence of avoidance, but the silence of a raw, open wound finally exposed to the air. Canyon, sensing the shift, let out a low groan. He lifted his head, his dark, intelligent eyes moving from one man to the other. He pushed himself up, his movements stiff, his shoulder clearly still sore. He walked first to Tom. He nudged the older man's hand, the one resting on his knee. Tom, lost in his regret, absently stroked the dog's head, his fingers finding the familiar spot behind his ears. "Hey, boy," he whispered. Then Canyon turned. He walked the few feet to Bradley, who was still rigid, his hands clenched around his cold mug. Canyon didn't nudge his hand. He pushed his heavy head under Bradley's arm, forcing it up from his lap, and then laid his head firmly on Bradley's thigh, his body pressing against his partner's leg. He was a living, breathing, physical link, his head on one man, his tail with a single, slow thump, brushing the leg of the other. He had chosen no sides. He had simply chosen them. Bradley's hand, the one that had been clenched, slowly uncurled. He looked down at the gray and white head on his lap. He saw the stitches, the proof of the dog's loyalty. He felt the steady, warm breathing. He let out a breath he felt he had been holding for 10 years. His hand came to rest on top of Canyon's head, his fingers scratching the familiar soft fur. He looked across the small space at his father. Tom was watching him, watching his hand on the dog. Bradley gave a single, slow, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. It wasn't forgetting. It wasn't an easy fix for a decade of pain. It was a beginning. Tom saw the nod, and his own shoulders, which had been tense for 10 years, finally relaxed. He nodded back, a silent, shared promise. The porch was quiet. The sun was warm. The air was still tense, but it was the tension of a broken bone beginning to knit, a painful, necessary, and hopeful process. The real healing had begun. The story of Bradley and Tom reminds us that sometimes the greatest sacrifices are hidden in plain sight, and that the deepest wounds can only be healed by the hard, painful truth. It shows us that loyalty, like the unwavering bond Canyon shared, is the anchor that holds us steady in the storm. If this tale of survival and reunion resonated with you, we would be honored if you shared it and perhaps left your own thoughts in the comments below. Your support by subscribing allows us to continue bringing these stories to light. We have another story we think you'll love waiting for you right now on the screen. We hope to see you there.